Many of our friends in Latin America remember when early CIA officials were in fact teaching that method in Paraguay and Brazil and also Guatemala. My friend Mario remembers in the earlier movement back in the 70s when the resistance was crushed in Guatemala. He would have been about 18. And it was the first of 2 different times he was in fact picked up and tortured. And he said he remembers being chained down to a metal chair and having people put wires in his mouth, and there was a North American there saying in a heavy American accent, "No, no, put the wires over there. It'll hurt more if you put it by that nerve ending over there." How much damage does that do to the person? Well, when he was describing that, 30 years had passed, and as he tried to describe more things to me, his arms went up in the air as if he was being crucified, and he started to scream. I told him he didn't have to tell me anything else. He wasn't able to. Dog attacks. We all saw those really terrifying photographs of the poor prisoner who had been attacked and terrorized and then later bitten by a dog. And we also all saw the US denials that immediately followed. That's not authorized, that's not supposed to happen, that's not a technique. Oops. Then came out some manual stuff saying, well, it is a technique, and in fact it was brought over from Guantanamo with this shift. And then we were told, well, it's, you know, it's just kind of a prank, it's not really anything to worry about. Is it just something that started with the war against terror? No. Sister Diana Ortiz had that technique used on her in Guatemala in 1989. An American nun who was gang raped and severely tortured in Guatemala. She endured 24 hours before someone came for her. That session included gang rape, more than 112 cigarette burns on her back alone, and having someone walk in and wrap her hand around a machete and stab the other woman prisoner to death. There are things you don't recover from. Inez Murillo, also in Honduras, was attacked by a ferocious dog after she'd been hung up from the ceiling by her hands for days on end. Both of them are terrified of dogs. Both of them also had an American involved. With Sister Diana Ortiz, at the end of the day, a very obvious American came in with a very obvious wig on, speaking bad Spanish with a heavy American accent, saying, "Are you guys crazy? She's a US citizen. It's all over the wires. Give her to her immediately. Give her to me immediately. I'm taking her to the embassy." And the people answered, "Yes, boss," and handed her over. This man knew where to find her, knew these death squad people by name, and he had authority over them. He took her out in his Jeep. She assumed she was about to be executed, jumped out of the Jeep and ran. The next day went back to the US Embassy and said, "Find your guy, find him, there's people dying in there, there's other people in there are children in there." And for the next 10 years, we all heard about how Sister Diana Ortiz was mentally disturbed and didn't really know what had happened to her, and there seemed to be a lot of contradictions. That was the backup she got from our State Department. Inez Murillo in Honduras, the head of the CIA, actually admitted during a secret testimony to the Intelligence Committee that Mr. Mike, who was coming in and out of that secret prison in Honduras with Battalion 316, asking questions, giving advice, etc., well, yeah, he was a CIA guy, we admit it. That later was published in a really remarkable series of articles by the Baltimore Sun. We were there, we were inside, we were paying money, we were getting information, and we're leaving people to die there. And people did die there. Stress and duress. Well, it's just rough interrogation techniques. It's uncomfortable positions. It's not torture, though. It's just uncomfortable. The man with the women's underpants on his head, people being forced to stand for 8 hours at a time, and so on and so forth. There's, in fact, a document signed, I believe, by Rumsfeld saying, "I stand for 8 hours at a time, why shouldn't the prisoners?" Well, the difference is when we stand for 8 hours at a time, we're moving around. A prisoner is not allowed to do that. The lymph then cannot flow up and down. You can't get rid of the swelling in your legs, and it becomes excruciating, and if it goes on for long enough, it can cause kidney problems, according to any physician. Herbert Anaya, who was later assassinated in Salvador, was picked up and kidnapped from a store in front of all of his children. His wife found out later that he was being held in the basement of the police station and sent her lawyer over. A young Salvadoran soldier answered the door and didn't know what to do and said, "Just a minute, I'll get the boss." Who came downstairs? The American advisor, who said, "Well, just a minute, I'll see what we can do." After about 45 minutes, he was allowed to speak to Herbert Anaya, who had a big blanket over his lap. He was later released and explained that they had put a blanket over his lap because he'd been standing so long they couldn't get his shoes back on his feet. They were that badly swollen. And about 6 months later, he was in fact shot to death on his front lawn while he put his kids into the car to take them to school. Inez Murillo also suffered from that particular technique where they tie the hands and feet together and string you from the ceiling. It's called a helicopter in Latin America. I don't know what they call it in Iraq, but the same technique is used. I asked her, how stressful was that? And she said, very stressful. It dislocated my shoulders. I still have problems. It's all torture. It all falls very easily within the definition of torture within the Geneva Conventions and our own felony statute for anyone that participates in torture of a prisoner abroad. That would be 28 U.S. Code 2340. All right, so we keep hearing now that if it was in fact a policy, which I think we don't have any doubt for, it goes all the way back to the 50s when the CIA was first formed and established. These are very definite practices and policies that the CIA has been carrying out since it was initiated. All right, well, is any of this actually legal? That was the backup argument we kept hearing from the Bush administration. The Geneva Conventions don't apply because they don't qualify as prisoners of war. Well, if we read the Third Geneva Convention, a prisoner of war is someone that was in a formal army that represents a government that was in uniform and stuff. Well, that would include the Taliban. It might not include insurgents in Iraq that were not part of a formal military. But that's where people like Mr. Gonzalez would stop talking, and you really need to keep talking because the Fourth Geneva Convention applies to civilians. Civilian is defined as anyone who is not in the military. It specifically includes saboteurs, people who are unfriendly to an invading or occupying power who use even deadly force. Sounds like a suicide bomber to me. Does the Fourth Geneva Convention say leave them on the streets so they can throw more bombs? No, it does not. It says you will treat them exactly the same as how we treated the Oklahoma bombers in this country. They can be picked up, they can be arrested, they can be held while a formal trial is worked out. They must be given a fair trial, and they cannot be tortured. That pretty much wipes us out, I think. Geneva Convention, it doesn't make it. Convention Against Torture doesn't make it. Our own felony statute doesn't make it. So why weren't they indicted? Well, because Mr. Gonzalez would have had to have done the indictment, and he clearly wasn't going to do that. So we have the executive branch of our government carrying out war crimes, while the same executive branch gets to decide whether there's going to be any indictments. Clearly our system of checks and balances has fallen apart a little bit, the CIA also being part of the executive branch. We have a really serious problem here. Very last justification for all of this that we heard over and over and over again and was sometimes difficult to answer. Do we have to allow it in this new age of terror? Do we have to allow torture, as in the Program 24, in order to keep the people of this country safe? You know, what I would always hear over and over is, if you don't allow these very rough practices, maybe it's regrettable, but if you don't allow it, it will be your fault when another 5,000 people die, when another World Trade Center collapses. Well, let's look at this argument. Because that, I think, really blocked a lot of people who wanted to get out there and protest right away. But no one wanted to be responsible for that kind of terror. I think we all remember the day the World Trade Center went down. And I had a number of people who were friends of mine that had offices in there. They just hadn't gone to work yet. Thanks be to God. So let's talk about the security angles. Number one, do harsher security methods increase or decrease national security, or any security? I think if we look through history, the answer is pretty obvious. Northern Ireland, no, I'd say that hasn't worked too well. Vietnam, didn't work too well. The French in Algeria, nope, didn't work too well.